Greetings, friends, and welcome to this podcast entitled Growing Old at Midlife, Finding Health, Wholeness, and Healing. My guest today is Marty Lehman, who I'm delighted to have with us, who's going to talk about her experience of early retirement and what went into that, and also introduce yourself to us. Marty, it's great to have you with us.
So I'm one of those people that spent most of my career in administrative roles. I started out actually graduating from college where I worked in child welfare and did adoptions and foster care, but then from that point on worked for Mennonite organizations, Goshen College, and went through all of the transition, or like what do we call it, transformation, when the two denominations merged. But I spent probably the longest time working for Mennonite Church USA Executive Board, and then ended my career working as an administrative pastor at College Mennonite Church. So yeah, pretty much administrative kinds of things, which I have enjoyed, and in particularly working for the church.
What did you particularly enjoy about the administrative call that you had, Marty?
I don't know. There's something about organizing things and solving problems and planning things and making sure that these ideas and things that you have actually take place and happen. And so, and then also just a lot of that where you make connections with people, you connect dots and connect people. So that was another part of it. I think when I worked for the denomination, one of the real joys there was just meeting people. You know, we went all over the United States. And so to see churches very different, and so much that you learn from visiting so many different churches.
So, Marty, you made the decision at some point to retire early, as you've described it. Can you talk about that, how that came about?
So in my early, I'll start a little earlier. When I went to College Mennonite Church as administrative pastor, I was in my late 50s, early 60s, somewhere in there. And I remember thinking this would be my last job. And I remember thinking that, you know, I don't need to worry or work on my resume anymore. And I remember that feeling really kind of strange. And so then I was in that role for, I don't know, 4 years, 5 years, something like that. But I remember the last couple of years just feeling less joy, less energy. It felt like tasks seemed more drudgery, maybe sometimes, than meaningful. And so I started paying attention to those kind of as these are signals that I'm burning out or I'm ready for something different. My husband is 7 years older than I am, so he actually retired early also, but not so much by choice. He was worked in mortgages, and so in the 2008 when that situation happened, he was kind of forced out. I mean, who's going to hire a 65-year-old white man? So he ended up retiring or semi-retiring earlier. So, but with that age difference, that was also another thing that I was thinking about was active retirement and how much and time together for the two of us. That also made me think about that. And so I began working with my spiritual director on some of this for the last couple of years, and she was very helpful in helping me think through things and why do I, pushing me on why I felt certain ways or what I was thinking or what was what was behind some of those things. I also remember at one point feeling like, oh, maybe I'm making the wrong decision and maybe I should work a couple more years. And then she again helped me, but remember, you had said this and you said that, and these were the reasons you were saying you were ready to retire. And so she helped me kind of rethink and not just operate on emotion. But it was, I guess I felt like my brain was telling me that it's time for a change.
Marty, how long was that period, that season for you of working through this?
I think it was probably 2 years, somewhere like that, 1.5 to 2 years.
And were you in turmoil in that decision making?
No, no. No, I thought it was, I mean, I'm not sure I could have done it without the help of a spiritual director. But um, no, I wasn't in turmoil. It was just a process.
So the spiritual director in particular brought to you what, Marty, in this kind of discernment?
She asked good probing questions
Mhm.
that I wouldn't have thought about otherwise. She would often, ask me things about what I thought God was trying to tell me with this or with that. She would ask me questions about how I felt when I, had certain thoughts. How does that make me feel? Does that give me joy, energy? Um, so she just, yeah, she helped me from my spiritual side, but also from the very human side of things.
Somewhere within you, there were these values embedded because
Mhm.
so many of our decisions, of course, are driven by our values. As you think about your life, what were the values that were perhaps put in place even as a child or throughout your life that would have contributed to saying, this is time to step off of what I was doing? That said, this is important to me, and I'm going to do this no matter what others might say or think.
I think the value that many of us Anabaptist people have is helping others. And sometimes maybe that's more self serving than we want to admit because it makes us feel good about ourselves. But I do think we all have that. We want to make a difference in people's lives. I feel like that value never really changed for me. As I began to think about retirement and what that might look like, I think I also, and again, I think my spiritual director helped me with this somewhat, but I don't think I looked at retirement as the end, but as a new beginning, a new part of my life. And so I saw that I've always thought that I would have a pretty active retirement as long as health allows. So that means continuing to serve. I know the one thing I often thought about is I'm still going to continue to do things and I'm still going to continue to work, however you define work. I'm just not going to get a paycheck.
Mhm.
And and so that's the primary difference. But I still want to serve the church. I still want to be engaged in my community. And I still want to help where I am able.
So can you describe what this landscape is like for you now? What you find yourself engaged in?
Now I'm like lots of retired people, they're so busy. I do remember when, right as I was retiring, I was asked to be a mentor by Indiana, Michigan Mennonite Conference for a pastor. And I remember, I'm not a person that says no very often, but I do remember saying no to that because I just recognized um, whenever I thought about doing that, it made me feel tired. And so I was kind of listening to rather than I didn't feel like I had joy when I thought about that. And I realized, well, I'm not going to serve this person well if I say yes to that. So I allowed myself, I think about 6 months where I really didn't take on anything. But since that time, yes, I've taken on things. I serve on the Leadership Discernment Committee for Mennonite Church USA, and then I'm working with a conference as a congregational coach, and I'm on several committees at church. I mean, and I still have I'm involved with our local homeowners association, so pretty soon my days fill up, and sometimes I'm like, boy, this is a really busy week. I don't even have time to take a nap today. Um, but again, I define busy differently. One of the things that I find is that I seldom do things in the evening unless there's a church meeting. And I almost find that an intrusion where when I worked, working into the evening, doing paperwork or reading emails or whatever would have been the norm. And so my schedule has also been redefined, and how, uh, yeah, how I order my day. Plus, I'm not a morning person, so you don't find me up very often before 7.
So how does the busyness of this season compare to the busyness of being employed for a paycheck? Is there any way that you think about that differently?
It is different. That's a good question, and I'm not sure I have thought about that very much, but I don't feel the same pressure, for one thing. Um, I'm not paid to be on a committee, and so I have a little bit more freedom if I don't follow through with something in the time frame maybe that I had planned. I feel there's more room for rearranging things on my schedule if I need to. Um, so yeah, I think it's mainly I don't feel the pressure. Um, and I'm also, I mean, it's also not scheduled as tightly. When I was working, sometimes I would literally be in meetings just about every hour all day long. And it was a really tight schedule, where now, today I have 3 appointments. That feels like a lot now.
Mhm.
And at that time, that would have probably been a light schedule.
Have there been surprises for you that you didn't foresee coming in the season like this?
I did not anticipate um, invitations to do interim pastorate work.
Mm,
I did not anticipate being a congregational coach for Indiana Michigan Conference. I didn't, those were just not things that were on my radar at all. And I have not done an interim pastorate. That um, something I have said no to, but coaching is something that I have done, or I am doing, and find something that I'm finding that I'm really enjoying, but it was nowhere on my radar screen at all. Um, the other, I mean, the non, I don't know, should say non-work, but the hobby things. I love gardening. And so
mm.
when we first retired, one of the things that we did is moved to our current house, where I had more flower gardens and more places to go outside. And so that's been, I mean, that's about what I expected. I really just, I enjoy getting out, and I don't know, there's something about digging in the dirt. I've also had more time to then enjoy things in the kitchen. I've started making sourdough bread, um, doing more cooking. Um, that I'm not sure that I really had any expectations one way or the other, but I do find that I have more time for exploring things. Oh, the other one that I've gotten into, it's almost become an obsession, is growing African violets.
Mm.
And yeah, it's become an interesting hobby that I did not expect that I would get involved in.
Marty, we have a cracked macadam driveway at home, and there's a little piece of ajuga coming through that crack. And I'm just thinking about what you're saying, and that when we have space, things emerge perhaps in our lives that we wouldn't have allowed to emerge when we covered those up with activity and busyness.
Hmm.
And it sounds like there's a kind of freedom to
Hmm.
explore and to
Hmm.
listen to yourself in a way that you couldn't before.
Right. Mhm.
Do you hear your own voice saying you should be working for employment or did you experience pressure from others who ask you, what are you doing, Marty? How has that been for you?
I haven't. I do think there were some people, I think, at church that weren't happy that I stepped down when I did, but I really haven't had, no, not much at all. The few voices, there were very few. It was more good for you. Um, I can't wait till I can do that. Those kinds of things. So really more support.
Mhm. Marty, I find it's unusual to talk to folks who are actively thinking of the horizon that is ahead of them. So one of the things you said in your email conversation with me is that you think about the last thing you'll do before the day of your death. There aren't a lot of folks who are thinking about that question. In fact, they're avoiding that question. And I think working up until the end of their life because they don't want to address that question. What made it possible for you, or what caused you to be open to that question? Where'd that come from for you?
That's a good question. Um, I was raised Amish.
Mm.
As my family, I was Amish until I was 10, and then my parents left the Amish church. Um, in the Amish world, death is very much part of life.
Mhm.
And there you don't work as actively as, in my opinion, I don't think the Amish work as hard at avoiding death
Mhm.
as maybe non-Amish would. They're much more comfortable with that. And certainly in my extended families, that would be the case. And so that's what I've seen modeled. Um, but I think when it's one thing to watch aunts and uncles and my grandparents who are all Amish model that for me, but then it feels different than when it's yourself and you realize that, like I had mentioned earlier, I'm not building a resume, I'm not working towards anything, some of these career goals. And so that death is the next thing after the end of retirement is death. And so I can't say that I'm totally comfortable with that. I feel like I have lots of questions. What does this look like? And some of it, maybe it's also just because I feel like I'm not done being on this earth in
Mhm.
this body. Again, something that I'm in conversation with my spiritual director on. So why does that still feel like, hey, I'm not quite ready for that yet? And then will I know when I am ready for it? Does anyone ever get ready for it? And how do you approach it with grace? But I do feel certainly death is a part of life, and we say it's something that we're not supposed to be afraid of. But I think the unknown is always a bit scary for all of us. And to me, yeah, so I would fall in that. I don't know that I would say it's scary, but on the other hand, it's the unknown. And
Yeah.
I don't, and if you've been an administrator, you like to know what's going on, what's planned and what's scheduled. And then, I can be a bit of a control freak. And you can't control
Yeah.
death.
It's really interesting you're describing the Amish experience because I think our formation in early childhood is so powerful in shaping, I was talking earlier about values and the way we see the world. And so the modern world certainly denies death, does a lot to avoid death. And so it's interesting to me to hear where that might come from for you. But at the same time, you're wrestling with there are things that I want to do
Mm-hmm.
and to be part of and engaged with. I sometimes talk with my students about eulogy virtues versus resume virtues, and that we live in a world where we say that we want to be remembered as being compassionate and kind and loving, but we live our lives not building towards those eulogy virtues, but filling our lives in space with resume virtues that often don't lead to what we really want. And it sounds to me like you found a way to make that transition, to come to peace with saying, this is what's really important to me. And I guess I wonder, do you recognize how unusual that capacity to do that is in the world we're living in? I think, um, do you think about that? How unusual this decision is?
Somewhat, but I guess I don't think about it that much. Again, I think some of it goes back to where I've come from.
Mhm.
Once a month, most months, I take my mother to it's a family gathering of her first cousins, her maternal first cousins. And they are all Amish except for one. And So for me to actually even have been working would be unusual in that group.
Mhm.
And so not to be working and to do the kind of things besides being on committees, that's certainly not in the Amish world. But some of these other things are very much the norm. So I think sometimes, sometimes I feel like I live in two cultures too, because I go to my go to events with my relatives, and that's a very different culture where a woman's role, though changing, certainly is more clearly defined. And versus then when my non-Amish world, where it's another set of rules. And so back and forth between those two. So what I'm doing is not at all unusual from among my Amish relatives. It's the norm. So maybe that's part of why it doesn't feel that unusual for me.
I'm not trying to psychoanalyze you, Marty, but when we were talking earlier about your openness to this question, I think sociologically, as we become more individualistic and atomic, um, we have been resistant. We're afraid of death because so many people die alone.
Mhm.
And there's a loneliness and a loss that when you are in a community, you not only are present when people die and with people in grief, but you've walked through that experience with others. And I think you're dying with a community around you.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
to hear you say not only did you grow up Amish, but you stayed connected to this community, I wonder if that's not part of the answer to your willingness
Mhm.
to ask this question, that so many of us aren't grounded. Certainly many of my students would have no idea what it's like to come from or be part of a community like that.
Mhm. Yeah, I remember many times on some of my roughest days at work, I would think about, maybe it was a coping mechanism, I don't know, but I would think about, if mom and dad hadn't left the Amish, my biggest concern today would be
Mm.
whether I'm getting all my tomatoes canned today or not, or something like that. And so sometimes that would help kind of bring me back to um, to life, I guess. Um, but yeah, I would say I've been very shaped um, by my Amish upbringing and my Amish relatives, and and my Amish aunts and uncles who are all very strong people and have been real role models in life in a lot of ways.
And yet you have made that decision to embrace that rather than to reject that,
Mhm.
as so many would, and to say, this set of values that I've gained is important and
Mhm.
is going to continue to shape me.
Mhm.
As you look forward, what are some things that yet you hope to do before that day of your death, Marty? What do you see in front of you that you would like to be part of your life?
I'm not sure that right now that I have any real
Yeah.
new goals. I think wanting to continue to be actively engaged as I have been. Um, I'm not a person that, some people have a lot of travel things on their list. I don't have a lot of that either. Um, I'm wanting to make sure that I figure out why my African violet, some of them keep dying. So it's my African violet propagation project is one of my goals, I guess, if I have a goal. But I guess I'm satisfied and content with life, um, and am enjoying life.
I sense that as I talk to you. Again, there's a
Mhm.
kind of groundedness that you're speaking out of. The African violets may be the tomatoes that you were thinking of earlier. Um,
Yeah, I do have some of those to can too.
I have one more question for you. So there's this social context and cultural context out of which this decision has at least been in part framed by or influenced by. What would you say to others who are thinking about making this decision but are really afraid of making this choice, and maybe don't have the context that you have?
Mhm. Mhm.
Any counsel, any wisdom for them?
Well, one thing I also didn't mention is that I know for some people, retirement has to do with finances.
Mhm.
And so I feel fortunate that I was able to retire early and could from a financial standpoint. So I recognize that gives me some privilege that maybe not everybody else
Mhm.
has. But I think often retirement, if people don't have hobbies or don't have other ways of being engaged, then retirement does look really scary.
Mhm.
But I guess, my primary encouragement is encouraging people to become engaged. There's so many ways in our communities and our schools. I mean, I have relatives in the school system, they're looking for people to read and to do this. And so there's just so many ways that we can become engaged, and its health allows for people to do that in the church community, um, the library. Yeah, there's many opportunities. Um,
And we know that engagement like that extends the quality of our life as
right,
we age, and it's just
right,
critically important.
right. Very much so. It's just very gratifying to be able to make a difference for someone and make their day better.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us, Marty? You've been delightful. I've not had anyone like this, and you're unusual in your sense of peace, and I think with making this decision.
Whenever people ask me how retirement's going, I say I highly recommend it. So I will leave that to people. I highly recommend it.
Thank you, Marty. Marty Lehman, our guest today, talking about early retirement and how she's arrived there and how she's enjoying and that experience. Thank you, Marty, for being with us, and
Thank you.
blessings to you.
And to you. Bye.